years. The average is around 1,000 years. So the time between the original writing and the manuscript we have, the copy we have, about 1,000 years. And that's for a good one, because some are even worse than that. But in any case, you look at the lapse, the event to the manuscript, 200 years, 100 years. Boy, if you're talking about Pliny, next best, we're talking 800 years or more, right? So I won't belabor the point because I've proven the point for you before. But in the New Testament documents, how good is the veracity of the New Testament documents compared to secular works? It's magnitudes better. It's magnitudes better in any bibliographical test. So one thing that really irritates me is why don't they use Colossians? Why do they use Josephus instead of Colossians, for example, in a New Testament or a first century study?
They don't want to admit that.
They don't want to admit something. Well, I don't know. In the turn century they did. Until now, you know, now. Well, turn century. Turn of the 20th century. There's another century out there. Also, you look at the primacy, whether it's a primary, secondary, or tertiary source. Pauline letters are all primary sources. Primary means it's a direct witness, and I don't have time to get into that because I want to get into some other stuff. But in any case, when we talk about the veracity of the documents, that is, how good are they? They pass the internal, external, and also the bibliographical tests. The only reason why these documents would not be acceptable, well, why aren't they acceptable historically, as historical documents? I can't answer that. Because if I'm teaching a class in this period, guess what I'm going to teach is historical documents. New Testament documents. They're the best history we got.
Because they're in the Bible and most people think they're only spiritual.
My goodness gracious. They're in the Bible. And by the way, that's Tübingen School thinking. Go look it up. Tübingen School with a umlauted U, Tübingen. Tübingen School is the reason we think the way we do today. I'm sorry to say. And it's a Lutheran group. So unfortunately, those guys, those pesky Tübingen guys, gave us what we got. But the reality is that, you know, one of the reasons that they don't teach truth, or that, how many have been taught the tools to know truth from the Greeks?
I mean, outside of here.
Outside of here, yeah. I mean, for goodness sake, this is the tools we know truth. You guys heard of scientific method, right? From my class, heard, well, if you've gone to court, you've used the legal historical method, right? And you've heard of logic.
Yes.
Well, why weren't you taught those as tools to know truth? Because part of the problem today is, guess what we want to do? Guess what's an embarrassment to a lot of historians?
The truth.
The fact that the New Testament documents in Colossians, as we're talking about today, beats any secular document by magnitudes, over 10 times, as a better source of history. So guess what you should be using if you're teaching a first century class?
The Bible.
The New Testament documents. I like to call them New Testament documents because a biblios is made of papyrus, and I don't think any of you guys are carrying papyrus around. And also because you can't get away with putting, some places you can't get away with having a Holy Bible on your desk, but you can sure get away with having a collection of New Testament and Old Testament documents on your desk, right? See?
Yes.
You got to be wise like serpents, right? In any case, let's talk about, I want to talk a little bit about the canon, because the other question that people have, a lot of people have this question, they say, okay, they're great historical documents, but how do you know we got the right, well, the proof of the historical legal method is, do you know that you have the right piece parts? Yes, you have to. Because number of documents, the lapse rate of the documents, that proves the fact that the documents have veracity, right? But there are all kinds of mythos, all over, that's Greek. There's all kinds of mythos about these documents, and I love to kill myths. A myth killer. Because remember, what do I teach? Literature, culture, and history. Forget about that other stuff, because I can't handle it. So let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about, we applied the test. There's no reason to not accept the legal historical, the veracity, the accuracy, or the authority, and when I say authority, I mean historical authority, of Colossians. Let's talk about the canon, though. In the beginning, this group that's called Christians, what did they call themselves?
The way.
Tin hodos. The way in Greek, tin hodos. Who called them Christians?
Antioch.
In Antioch, they were first called, Antioch is a Greek city. In Antioch, they first called them Christians. Why wouldn't these guys want to be called Christians?
Wasn't real popular.
We're going to get into this. The way the Mysterion named its people, its name, the way a Mysterion named itself, is it always named itself after its god or its leader. Therefore, the Pythagorean Mysterion was named after Pythagoras. The Osirian Mysterion was named after the god Osiris. So therefore, the Christian Mysterion is named after Christ. In Antioch, the Mysterion Greeks, which, by the way, everybody in the Greek world was a Mysterion believer or Mysterion member, pretty much. So the reason they're called Christians is because this is the name that the Greeks gave Teen Hodos, because it looked a lot like a Mysterion to them. I'm going to tell you why it's not, but it's really interesting, isn't it, that Christianity looked like a Mysterion. And one of the things we're going to talk about a lot in Colossians, because it's mentioned 4 times, is Mysterion. You can't talk about New Testament without talking about Mysterion. In any case. So in the beginning, what did they have that were their documents? What did Teen Hodos have for documents?
Torah.
The Torah, the Old Testament scrolls, right? Did they have any New Testament documents? Nope, not a single one. They had none. So at the beginning, Teen Hodos, all they had was the Old Testament, and that's what they call the canon. So when Timothy writes about Scripture having authority, what is he talking about? He's talking about the Old Testament. He's talking about the Old Testament being theopneuma, God breathed. Is he talking about New Testament? No, he's not. He's only talking about Old Testament documents. So they had Old Testament documents. I don't think I have time. I'm going to have to talk about it a little bit, but let's talk about the Septuagint. Septuagint is really important. Usually when we talk about the Septuagint, it's written LXX. Bring out a space, get to erase something. LXX is the Septuagint because it stands for 70. Septuagint means 70. The Septuagint is the translation around 200, 250 BC of the Hebrew scrolls into Greek in Alexandria. The why this is important is because every quote in the New Testament from the Old Testament, every allusion in the New Testament from the Old Testament comes from the Septuagint. It does not come from the Hebrew. It comes from the Septuagint because this is the translation into Greek. Guess what? New Testament documents are all Greek. And so they used the Septuagint. So all those quotations, all those things were in Greek from the Septuagint. So they had the Septuagint. This is a word that's called theopneuma, God breathed. Ooh. That's interesting. But anyway, I'm not going to get much into that. In any case, Jesus likely spoke and understood. He read Hebrew because Hebrew was a dead language at the time. They didn't speak it. They read it. He knew Aramaic. What was his primary language? How do we know that?
Because it'll say, if he spoke something different, they'll actually state what he spoke in.
Precisely. They actually quote it. So, for example, when he talks to the little girl and speaks to her in Aramaic, he says, Tabitha kum. I don't do Aramaic, but he says Tabitha kum, which means stand up in Aramaic. When he's on the cross and he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is a mixture of Aramaic and Hebrew. If he was speaking Aramaic and Hebrew all the time, what would you do?
Quote him all the time.
You'd quote him all the time, or you'd write it in Aramaic. But guess what? All the New Testament documents are in Greek. And they quote him when he says something that's not Greek. So then you know that Jesus' primary language was Greek. He's speaking Greek. Which should be, it blows me away that there are current scholars who have an idea even that he spoke Aramaic. That's kind of silly. And they're looking for Aramaic Gospels. You ain't going to find it. Because it's quite obvious that he spoke Greek. But in any case, the literature in the New Testament we find is all Greek. Well, that makes sense, right? And also the thing that's very important about Greek, and we're going to get more into this because I'll talk about Greek as a language, or Greek as a written language, ancient Greek. But remember what I told you, Greek is logos to telos, an argument to a conclusion. So basically, you can expect that Jesus, you can expect that Paul, you can expect that all these New Testament writers are writing in what sense? Logos to telos. And this is really important because, and I'll erase for that. I'll repeat this more than once because this is probably one of the most important points you can get from this class or any class in this ancient period. In English, we write how?
Left to right.
I haven't done this in a long time. Intro, body, and conclusion. And as I tell my classes, if you don't write this way, you need to, because you're not communicating in English. In Hebrew, anybody remember how Hebrew write? Synopsis, body. That's why when people tell me, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I know enough about Hebrew to know this. So when people say, you know, there's two creation stories. Well, yeah, duh. Synopsis, body. They say, do you know there's two Noah stories? Yeah, synopsis, body. All you're telling me is that you don't know anything about Hebrew. See? When anyone tells me this, I don't care if it's a pastor, they say, you know there's two stories on the creation. Duh. You know? Are you stupid? Oh, sorry. But anyway, you know, the point is that anyone, well, they're supposed to study this stuff, right? In any case, how is Greek? Logos to telos. And the way we usually draw that, logos, telos. Because the telos is usually not stated, right? The point is that if you're trying to read a Greek document as intro, body, conclusion, what's going to happen? You're going to fail. If you try to read it as a synopsis body, what's going to happen? You're toast. The only way to read these documents is logos to telos construction, and that's what we try to do, is we try to look at the logos to telos. Once I point this out to you, guess what? If you start looking at these documents, all of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 27 of all those Old New Testament documents, look at them as a logos to telos, and guess what you get? You start seeing what they mean, because they aren't what you think many times. Or they say things that are not necessarily what you have been taught per se. I won't say it changes theology. I'm not going to say it changes doctrine. I don't believe it does. But what it does change is it changes your realization of what the documents are trying to communicate to you. And I think that's what's really important. Because what do we want to know ultimately about Colossians? What does it say? Right? We've read it all our lives and we're like, oh, well, you know, we got all these dissertations about it. Well, you know, let's throw away the dissertations for now and let's look at what the words of the Greek say. That's the point. So, this literature of the New Testament, okay, we do find a mixture of the forms. That is, we find a mixture of Hebraic and Greek to a certain degree. I'll try and point that out to you, because we do see some synopsis body, and we do see some very interesting stuff that really is related to Greek historical documents. Like, for example, in the Acts, we do see an introduction, more like a prologue. Prologue, it's not really an introduction per se, but it is an explanation of why he did the work, which we also find in Herodotus. So I didn't bring my Herodotus to quote that, but in any case. In any case, these Jesus and these apostles, these guys who are writing this, Paul, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, all those guys that are writing these documents, the most important thing to recognize is, what is their primary language? Greek. Well, they may have learned Aramaic at their mother's knee, but they obviously all speak Greek. And so they think, obviously, in Greek terms, and they also think in Aramaic terms, right? So what we have to be cognizant of is this is a mixed community. And by the way, Paul, a trained Pharisee, which I don't have time today to get into the details about Pharisees. I talked about it last week a little bit, I think. That was another class. I'll have to bring that in. But Pharisees, I guess I have to say that. Pharisees, remember, were really big time into Mishnah and Torah and Talmud. You say, what's that? The Torah is the Old Testament, right? The Pentateuch, the first 5 books. The Tanakh is the rest of the whole of those scrolls, all of the things, whatever, 63 or whatever books in the Old Testament, or what, 39, or whatever.
39.
Something like 39 in the Old Testament. Well, it depends if you have the apocryphal books in. Because guess what they used in this period? They're using Septuagint, which means they have what? All the apocryphal books, which, by the way, was not taken out of our Bibles until 1833, but that's another story. So in any case, the Apocrypha is all in their hands. So they have the Apocrypha, they have the Torah, they have the Mishnah, the oral Torah. The Talmud was written in approximately 100 AD, which is when they wrote down the Mishnah and all the conversations around the Mishnah. So the Pharisees have all of that. And guess what Paul is a scholar of? All of those things, because he's a Pharisee. So Paul is steeped in this. He probably has to turn his brain back to write to these people. He's writing in Greek. He's writing to Jews and Gentiles. So he, in the ancient world, is probably one of the best educated guys you're going to talk to. Because he also knew who else did he know? He knew Greek. He knew really good Greek. Because remember what he quoted in Athens? He quoted the Greek poets. Wow! And to the Cretan, he quoted a Crete poet. So the guy knew Crete. He knew Greek Cretan documents. He knew Greek poet documents. The guy was very well educated. And by the way, he tells Timothy. Remember, we like to translate that one verse about studying Scripture. But guess what he tells him to study? He says, study all graphia. In other words, all writings are worthy of study. That's what Paul said. So Paul wanted Timothy to be conversant in not just the Hebraic documents, but also in the Greek documents. You notice that Paul had some success with those Greek documents. But in any case, the literature of the New Testament, it's Greek, steeped in other forms, and that's what we need to look at. Now, how do we get this canon? A lot of people believe that the Council of Nicaea said that there's going to be a canon. Guess what? Until the Reformation, there was no council of the churches that ever stated a canon. When I say canon, you know what I'm talking about? The scripture that is to be read in the churches. The Council of Nicaea did not. No earlier council did. And only in the Reformation period did the Catholic Church state the books that should be read, that is, the books of the canon. Now, somebody else, some other group did in this period. Want to venture? Well, the Jews did it in 90 to 100 AD at the Council of Jamnia, which is a Jewish council, not a Christian council. The Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Anglicans, all of these guys put down their list. The reason it was important is because guess what no one had made a list of? The documents.
Actual documents.
Which ones are you going to trust? Guess what they used in the Reformation period to determine which documents should be included and which should not be included? You want to guess? I've been teaching it to you for years here. The historical legal method. They looked at how many documents, manuscripts did they have? The lapse of manuscripts. They looked at the documents themselves. I'm going to talk about that if we get time at the end here because it's really important. Originally, heresy drove the first lists of what we call the canon. There never were any lists that the church stated specifically. But the first guy to put out a list was Marcion. Marcion put out a list. Marcion was born in 85 AD. He put out his list, and we're not exactly sure the exact date, but we know he put out his list. Say he's a middle-aged kind of guy, 40 so, okay? So he put out his list in about 120 AD. If you have a list in 120 AD, what does that presume?
You read the original document.
You got them! Yeah, you got the documents. And so in his list, Marcion listed Luke, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, and Philemon. And that made Irenaeus mad. Because Marcion was, anybody heard of the Marcionian heresy? Marcion was considered a heretic because he was a true Gnostic. And I'll talk about Gnosticism when we get into Mysterion. But one of the problems in Colossae, in the Colossians, is what? Anybody want to venture a guess? Gnosticism. That's right, they're Gnostics. They have Gnostics infiltrating. Guess Marcion was a Gnostic, considering a Gnostic heresy. In his list, he does include the Colossians, which is really interesting. Irenaeus, who was born in 130 BC or AD, basically, Irenaeus was the first guy to respond to Marcion, and he put out his own list. Irenaeus was a bishop. And so, as a bishop of the church, he did it for his church, which I believe was in Asia Minor, because Marcion was in Asia Minor. So Irenaeus put out his list, which included almost all the ones that we're used to, that we expect, in our group, in our documents. So the very first list included all the documents, the 27 documents of the New Testament, and that was from Irenaeus. Origen put out his list in 180. He was born in 185. Anastasius put out his around 300 and something. That's about the time of the Nicene, right? Council of Nicaea. But guess what? Until the Reformation, there were no official lists from any official churches. The Catholic Church didn't have a list. Because what did the Catholic Church use? How did the Catholic Church view all these documents? Historically. They viewed the Old Testament documents as theopneuma, including all the Septuagint documents. So all the Apocryphal documents were considered by the Catholic Church to be theopneuma. The Apocryphal Old Testament. But what did they consider the New Testament documents? Historical documents. That's it. Just historical. That's an interesting view, because our view today is what? They are inspired, God-breathed. But that idea came out of the Reformation. That's a new idea. Who invented that idea? Anybody want to guess? Martin Luther. Martin Luther did.
What was his, I guess, being a scholar of that time, very much steeped in the ways of the no truth, what was his reasoning for his conclusion?
The reason that they did it, okay, in the Reformation period, okay, what was the authority? What is the authority in the Catholic Church? Pope. Pope. Councils. Pope councils, and then historical documents. Okay? The popes and councils take precedence over the historical documents in the Catholic Church.
Make it dictate.
But what did Luther propose?
Historical documents first.
In other words, it is, what do we say? Solo scriptura. Okay? So therefore, what did I have to do? If I killed the Pope and councils, then I'm left with the documents. Well, what is Scripture? That's the question. Because the main question of Reformation is, what is Scripture? If you get rid of your Pope and councils, the popes and the councils tell you what you should read, right? And it may not just be the Old Testament and New Testament. I mean, there are other things that they wanted you to read, which were good stuff. You should read them. Like, for example, Augustine, right? So the big question that came out of the Reformation period is, what should we use in our Bibles? And I mean Bibles collectively, not biblios. So what are we going to use in our Old Testament and New Testament documents? And so they had to determine that. So what they did is they went back and they looked at all these things that I talked about. The degree of the source. They looked at where the source came from. They looked at the manuscripts. They looked at all these details. And guess what they found in the New Testament documents? There's some disputed works. Matter of fact, what was one of the disputed, we've talked in detail about one of the disputed works from this. What is that? From the Septuagint, the disputed works, the Apocrypha. What did Martin Luther do to solve that problem? He put them at the end of the Old Testament in a separate section. Guess what he did with the disputed New Testament works? He put them at the end in their own section. Guess what we did? We reshuffled them. Now, how come we didn't get our Apocrypha back, but we got those books back? Anyway, the works that are disputed, the works that came under question by, and this is not, well, Martin Luther was the main guy for these works, but, you know, under the whole Christian community at the time, you know, Calvinists, Anglicans, Lutherans, Anabaptists, all these guys had a problem with these documents. Hebrews, James, Jude, 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and the Revelation of John. Those are the ones that Martin Luther threw in the back. He threw them under the bus. No, he threw them in the trunk. The reason that they had doubts, there were various. You know, the author of Hebrews doesn't identify himself. James was not an apostle. He was a brother of Christ and also the head of the church in Jerusalem, but he wasn't an apostle, or he was not called an apostle. His message seemed to contradict Paul's message. Martin Luther didn't like James.
No, he didn't.
Jude was not an apostle, and he quotes books which the church did not receive as scripture. That's Jude quotes some. Well, and so does Matthew, but I guess we're not too hot about Matthew. You know, we're not dumping Matthew under the bus. 2nd Peter was not widely distributed at first. The author of 2nd and 3rd John does not identify himself plainly. So. And also, you know, Revelations, author of Revelations identifies himself as John, but does not say he's the apostle of John. The style and quality of the book is different from the other Gospels and letters. So, the point is this. The canon basically was determined by the Reformation, and that's where we got it. The legal historical method was what was used. We don't have translations of translations. We have the original Greek. We have 779 Greek copies. So guess what? How sure are we that we have a good copy of Colossians? Very sure.
Very sure.
So when we start looking at Colossians in the Greek, how assured am I that we have a verifiable, good veracity source of historical information from that period?